body bag moved as I sealed it, fabric rippling from the inside as someone tried to sit up. My name is Danny Walsh, and I've worked as an ER technician at County General for 7 years. My responsibilities include patient transport, equipment maintenance, and post-mortem procedures when trauma cases don't survive. It's demanding work, but straightforward. Follow protocols, maintain dignity, ensure proper documentation. But in January, the deceased patients began responding to final preparations. The anomaly started with routine trauma processing. Curtis Blake, 34, motorcycle accident victim, had been pronounced dead after 2 hours of resuscitation attempts. Dr. Patricia Hendricks had called time of death at 11:47 p.m. following failed cardiac intervention. Standard procedure: disconnect monitoring equipment, prepare body for morgue transfer, complete documentation. I'd assisted with Curtis Blake's resuscitation efforts. Multiple cardiac arrests, massive internal bleeding, severe head trauma. The surgical team had worked tirelessly, but his injuries were incompatible with survival. When Dr. Hendricks made the pronouncement, there was no doubt about the outcome. Yet when I zipped the body bag, Curtis Blake's hand pressed against the fabric from inside. Not muscle spasms. Those are common in recent deaths. This was deliberate movement, fingers spread against the bag's interior as if trying to prevent closure. The pressure was consistent, purposeful, like someone consciously resisting being sealed inside. I reopened the bag immediately. Curtis Blake lay motionless, no signs of life, pupils fixed and dilated. No pulse, no respiratory effort, skin showing early signs of lividity. Definitely deceased. But when I attempted to close the bag again, the same resistance occurred. Hands pressing outward, preventing the zipper from completing its path. I called Dr. Hendricks to verify death pronouncement. Dr. Hendricks, I need confirmation on Curtis Blake, showing some unusual post-mortem movement during transport preparation. Danny, Mr. Blake has been deceased for 43 minutes. No cardiac activity, no brain function, no possibility of revival. Standard post-mortem preparations should proceed normally. Doctor, I'm getting resistance when trying to seal the body bag. Consistent pressure from inside. Post-mortem spasms are normal, Danny. Complete the transport and documentation. But this wasn't typical muscle contraction. The resistance was too coordinated, too responsive to my actions. Every time I attempted to close the bag, the same pattern occurred. Hands pressing outward, fabric bulging from internal pressure, zipper mechanism meeting consistent opposition. I eventually completed the seal by working in sections, closing portions of the bag while the resistance focused on other areas. But the movement continued even after full closure, fabric shifting rhythmically as if someone inside was breathing. I transported Curtis Blake to the morgue, but the movement persisted throughout the journey. The body bag maintained its strange rhythm, expanding and contracting slightly, as if the occupant was still alive. Morgue staff accepted the transfer without comment. But I noticed they handled the body bag carefully, as if aware of the internal movement. Over the following weeks, similar incidents occurred with other trauma deaths. Maria Santos, fatal car accident, resisted body bag closure by pressing both hands against the fabric. Thomas Chen, workplace injury victim, attempted to unzip the bag from inside during transport. Patricia Murphy, heart attack fatality, created enough internal pressure to partially open the sealed bag. Every deceased trauma patient showed the same resistance to final preparations. I began documenting the phenomenon systematically. Time of death pronouncement, nature of resistance during bag closure, duration of post-mortem movement, morgue staff observations. The pattern was consistent across all cases. Trauma deaths resisted being sealed, transported, and filed away. On February 12th, I had a conversation that changed my understanding of the situation. While transporting a deceased patient, Helen Chang from the morgue staff made an unexpected comment. Danny, the trauma cases have been particularly active lately. More movement, more resistance to storage. We've had to modify our handling procedures. Helen, you're seeing the same movement I've been documenting? Of course. Trauma deaths are always more persistent than natural deaths. They don't accept the transition as easily. Takes them longer to settle into the process. I realized the morgue staff had been dealing with the phenomenon routinely. The resistance to body bags, the internal movement, the ongoing activity, it was normal for trauma cases. How long does the movement typically continue? Depends on the circumstances of death. Sudden trauma, unfinished business, strong attachment to life. Those factors influence how long they remain active. Some settle within hours, others take days or weeks. Helen showed me modified body bags designed for active deceased patients, reinforced zippers, pressure release valves, monitoring windows, equipment specifically created to accommodate post-mortem movement. We've learned to work with them rather than against them. Fighting the resistance just prolongs the transition period. Better to acknowledge their activity and provide appropriate accommodation. I asked Helen to explain their procedures for handling active deceased patients. We talked to them during transport, explain what's happening, provide reassurance about the process. Most of them calm down once they understand the transition is temporary. Temporary? Danny, death isn't a single event, it's a process. Trauma patients often need time to accept what happened, to complete unfinished thoughts, to say goodbye properly. The movement you're seeing is their way of processing the transition. Helen demonstrated her technique with the next trauma case. Instead of struggling with the body bag closure, she spoke directly to the deceased patient. Mr. Morrison, your injuries were severe, and your body couldn't continue functioning. The medical team did everything possible to save you. We're going to transport you now to a quiet place where you can rest and process what happened. The resistance to bag closure decreased significantly. The internal movement became gentler, more accepting rather than fighting. The key is communication, Danny. They can still hear, still understand. They just need someone to explain the situation and guide them through the transition. I began incorporating Helen's communication techniques into my transport procedures, speaking directly to deceased patients, explaining the process, providing reassurance about what was happening. The resistance diminished dramatically. Trauma patients still moved within body bags, but the movement became cooperative rather than resistant. On March 8th, I had my most significant experience with active deceased patients. Multiple trauma victims from a bus accident arrived simultaneously, 7 fatalities, all requiring transport preparation within a short time frame. As I prepared the first body bag, I heard voices from inside the other bags. Not spoken words, but clear communication. Trauma victims talking to each other, sharing experiences, processing their deaths collectively. The pain stopped suddenly. I remember seeing the bus coming toward us. Is everyone else okay? Are the other passengers safe? They were having a conversation about the accident, comparing their final moments, ensuring everyone had survived the transition successfully. I realized the deceased trauma patients were providing support to each other, helping newer arrivals understand and accept their deaths. I began facilitating these conversations during transport, allowing time for deceased patients to communicate before individual morgue storage. Take a moment to connect with the other passengers. Share your experiences, help each other process what happened. The post-mortem activity became more organized, purposeful. Instead of random resistance, the movement represented systematic communication and mutual support among trauma victims. On April 15th, Curtis Blake, the motorcycle accident victim from January, made contact with me during a transport. Not verbal communication, but clear understanding transmitted through the movement within his body bag. He wanted me to contact his sister to tell her he was okay, that the accident wasn't her fault for lending him the motorcycle. I researched Curtis Blake's family and called his sister, Janet Blake. Ms. Blake, this is Danny Walsh from County General. I assisted with your brother's care after his accident. He wanted me to tell you that he's okay and that the accident wasn't your fault. Janet Blake broke down crying. I've been carrying that guilt for months. Curtis borrowed my motorcycle the night he died. I blamed myself for letting him take it. Your brother wants you to know he doesn't blame you. He's at peace with what happened. I've continued my ER technician duties for 6 months since Curtis Blake's message. The deceased trauma patients continue their post-mortem activity, but I've learned to work with their transition process rather than against it. Some deaths require more time and support to process completely, and our emergency department has been providing that assistance to patients who need extended care during their transition from life to whatever comes next. The appointment book showed no scheduled sessions for 3:00 p.m., but Mrs. Patterson sat in my office describing her grief over a husband who wouldn't die for another 6 months. My name is Dr. Lisa Morgan, and I've provided grief counseling at Riverside Medical Center for 8 years. My specialty is helping families process loss, navigate the stages of grief, and develop healthy coping mechanisms for life after death. Grief counseling requires careful attention to timeline, emotional progression, and the unique circumstances surrounding each loss. But in February, my sessions began addressing deaths that hadn't yet occurred. The anomaly started with routine grief counseling. Mrs. Catherine Patterson, 67, had requested sessions to help process her husband's declining health. Robert Patterson had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia, a difficult situation but not immediately life-threatening. The sessions were preventive, preparing Mrs. Patterson for the eventual challenges of caregiving and the possibility of future loss. But during our February 15th session, Mrs. Patterson described emotions and experiences that couldn't have happened yet. "The funeral was beautiful," she said, tears streaming down her face. So many people came to honor Robert. The pastor shared wonderful stories about his volunteer work at the food bank. Robert would have been proud of how the community remembered him. I checked my notes. Robert Patterson was still alive, still living at home with supportive care. No funeral had been planned, no services scheduled. "Mrs. Patterson, I think there may be some confusion. Robert is still with you. We're working on preparing for future challenges, not processing current loss. Dr. Morgan, we buried Robert last Thursday." The service was at St. Andrew's Church, followed by interment at Greenwood Cemetery. "I don't understand why you're speaking as if he's still alive." I reviewed her file carefully. Mrs. Patterson had scheduled grief counseling to address anticipatory grief related to her husband's dementia diagnosis. Robert Patterson was receiving outpatient memory care but remained functional and living independently. "Mrs. Patterson, let's take a moment to ground ourselves in the present. Can you tell me what you had for breakfast this morning?" "Toast and coffee, same as always. But I only made one piece of toast because I keep forgetting Robert won't be joining me anymore. It's been 3 weeks since the funeral, but I still set 2 places at the table." She was experiencing active grief for a death that hadn't occurred, processing emotions related to events that existed only in the future. I ended the session early and called Robert Patterson directly to verify his status. "Mr. Patterson, this is Dr. Morgan, your wife's counselor. I wanted to check on how you're both managing with the recent changes in your care routine." "Dr. Morgan, Catherine and I are doing well. The memory exercises you suggested have been helpful. We're planning a trip to visit our grandchildren next month." Robert Patterson was alive, alert, and making future plans, but his wife was grieving his death as if it had already occurred. I researched grief counseling literature for similar cases. Anticipatory grief that became indistinguishable from actual grief, emotional processing that preceded triggering events, temporal displacement in therapeutic settings. I found no comparable documentation. On February 22nd, Mrs. Patterson returned for her scheduled appointment. I expected to address the confusion from our previous session, to help her distinguish between preparation and actual loss. Instead, she provided detailed updates on her grief process since Robert's funeral. "The hardest part is the silence," she explained. 43 years of marriage, and suddenly no one to talk to during meals. "I've started eating in the living room with the television on, just to have voices in the house." She described specific aspects of widowhood, disposing of Robert's medications, donating his clothes to charity, learning to manage finances independently. Details that indicated she had actually experienced these tasks, not just imagined them, but Robert Patterson remained alive and active. I decided to test the situation by asking about specific events. "Mrs. Patterson, can you tell me about the last conversation you had with Robert before he passed?" "We were sitting on the front porch after dinner watching the sunset. Robert said he was proud of the life we'd built together, that he wasn't afraid of what came next. He asked me to take care of his garden and to remember him when the roses bloomed each spring." The conversation was detailed, emotionally consistent, and felt completely authentic. Mrs. Patterson was accessing memories of events that hadn't yet occurred. On March 1st, I contacted Robert Patterson again to schedule a joint session, hoping to address the temporal displacement directly. "Mr. Patterson, I'd like to schedule a session with you and Catherine to work on communication strategies as you navigate the memory care process." "Dr. Morgan, I'm not sure what you mean." "Catherine has been in individual grief counseling since my funeral 3 weeks ago. We haven't spoken since I passed away." I stared at the phone. Robert Patterson was talking about his own death as a completed event while simultaneously being alive and conscious. "Mr. Patterson, we're speaking right now." "You answered the phone. You're clearly alive. Yes, I'm speaking with you now. But I died on February 18th following complications from the dementia. Catherine is processing my death with your support. This conversation is separate from those events. I realized both timelines were occurring simultaneously. Robert Patterson existed in the present as a living person while also existing in the past as someone who had died 3 weeks ago. Mrs. Patterson was grieving his death while he remained alive. I was counseling clients who were experiencing multiple temporal realities simultaneously. On March 8th, I discovered the source of the phenomenon. In my office filing cabinet, I found client notes I didn't remember writing. The handwriting was mine, but the content described sessions I hadn't conducted with people I'd never met. The notes detailed grief counseling sessions with Helen Murphy, who was processing her daughter's death in a car accident. But Helen Murphy had no children. The notes described sessions with James Morrison, grieving his wife's cancer death. But James Morrison had never been married. I was apparently conducting counseling sessions with clients who didn't exist, addressing grief for deaths that hadn't occurred. But the session notes were thorough, professional, and emotionally authentic. They described genuine grief processes, realistic therapeutic interventions, and positive counseling outcomes. I was somehow providing effective grief counseling for situations that existed only on paper. On March 15th, I made a disturbing discovery. The session notes included detailed entries about my own grief counseling. According to the documentation, I was receiving therapy to process my father's death in a construction accident. My father had died in a construction accident when I was 12 years old. But according to these notes, the death had occurred last month, and I was currently receiving grief counseling from myself. The notes described my emotional process, my therapeutic goals, my progress in accepting the loss. They were written in my handwriting, signed with my credentials, and documented sessions where I served as both counselor and client. I was providing grief therapy to myself for my father's death, processing it as both a childhood trauma and a recent loss. On March 22nd, Mrs. Patterson returned for what would be our final session together. Dr. Morgan, I wanted to thank you for your help during this difficult time. The grief counseling has been invaluable in helping me process Robert's death and begin building a life without him. Mrs. Patterson, I need to ask you directly, is Robert alive or dead? Both, she replied simply. Robert is dead in the sense that our marriage, our shared daily life, our future plans together have ended. But he's alive in the sense that he continues existing, loving me, supporting my transition to widowhood. She pulled out a photograph, herself and Robert at what appeared to be his funeral, both smiling, both clearly present and participatory in the service. Death doesn't end relationships. Dr. Morgan, it changes their format. Robert and I continue our marriage, but now it includes his death as one of our shared experiences. I understood then that grief counseling had become a bridge between different temporal realities, allowing clients to process multiple versions of events simultaneously. The therapy sessions were helping people navigate relationships that existed across different timelines, providing support for grief that occurred both before and after the triggering deaths. On April 5th, Robert Patterson called to thank me for helping Catherine process his death. Dr. Morgan, Catherine is doing much better since starting grief counseling. She's learned to maintain our connection while accepting the reality of my death. Your therapeutic approach has been very effective. Mr. Patterson, are you currently alive or dead? I'm currently both, which is why Catherine needed professional support. Navigating relationships that exist across multiple temporal states requires specialized counseling skills. I realized my grief counseling practice had evolved beyond traditional therapy. I was helping clients maintain relationships with deceased loved ones who remained actively involved in their lives, providing therapeutic support for connections that transcended conventional death. I've continued my counseling practice for 7 months since the Patterson case. My client load includes both living and deceased individuals, all processing grief that occurs across multiple timelines simultaneously. Some therapeutic relationships are too important to be limited by traditional concepts of life and death, and my practice has been providing support for clients who need assistance navigating love that persists, regardless of temporal circumstances. Margaret Wells requested chicken soup for dinner, but Margaret had died that morning at 6:47 a.m. My name is Carol Stevens, and I've worked dietary services at Peaceful Valley Hospice for 10 years. My responsibilities include meal preparation, dietary planning, and accommodating final food requests for patients approaching end of life. Hospice care emphasizes comfort, dignity, and honoring patients' wishes during their final days. But in April, patients began ordering meals after their deaths. The anomaly started with routine dietary service. Margaret Wells, 83, had been a hospice resident for 6 weeks, receiving palliative care for terminal cancer. Her appetite had declined significantly in recent weeks, but she occasionally requested simple comfort foods: chicken soup, vanilla pudding, chamomile tea. Margaret died peacefully on April 12th. Her family had gathered for final goodbyes. Staff had provided comfort care, and all protocols had been followed. The death certificate was completed by Dr. Patricia Hendricks at 6:47 a.m. But at 5:30 p.m., Margaret's meal request appeared on the evening dietary roster: chicken soup, saltine crackers, chamomile tea. I assumed administrative error and checked with the nursing staff. This is Carol in dietary. I'm showing a meal request for Margaret Wells, but she passed away this morning. Carol, Mrs. Wells, died early this morning. Her room has been cleaned and prepared for the next admission. There shouldn't be any active meal requests. I double-checked the dietary computer system. Margaret Wells, room 14, chicken soup dinner, scheduled for 6 p.m. delivery. The request had been entered at 5:15 p.m. Logged as coming directly from the patient. I decided to investigate by preparing the requested meal and delivering it to room 14. The room was empty, cleaned and ready for the next patient. Fresh linens, sanitized surfaces, no personal belongings. But when I placed the meal tray on the bedside table, I heard a soft "thank you" from the direction of the bed. No one was visible in the room, but the gratitude was clear, heartfelt, recognizably Margaret Wells's voice. I left the meal and returned 2 hours later to collect the tray. The soup bowl was empty, crackers consumed, teacup drained. No staff had entered the room. I checked with nursing. No family members had visited. Security confirmed no visitors to room 14. Margaret Wells had consumed her final meal 8 hours after her death. Over the following weeks, similar requests appeared from other deceased patients. Harold Morrison, who died on April 18th, ordered his favorite breakfast on April 19th: oatmeal with brown sugar, orange juice, black coffee. When I delivered the meal to his empty room, I found it consumed within hours. Patricia Chen, deceased April 25th, requested Chinese takeout on April 26th. Thomas Murphy, who passed April 30th, ordered a birthday cake on May 1st, which would have been his 74th birthday. The hospice was serving meals to patients who were no longer alive. I researched hospice dietary protocols, hoping to find guidelines for post-mortem meal requests. I found comprehensive documentation about accommodating final wishes, providing comfort foods, and honoring cultural dietary preferences during end-of-life care, but nothing about serving meals after death. I decided to monitor the situation more systematically. I began preparing requested meals for deceased patients and observing the consumption patterns. The meals were always consumed completely. Plates returned clean, cups emptied, utensils used appropriately, but no physical presence was visible during consumption. The deceased patients maintained their dining preferences, dietary restrictions, and meal timing schedules exactly as they had while living. On May 15th, I had a conversation with Margaret Wells that clarified the situation. Was delivering her requested chicken soup the same meal she'd ordered daily since her death? When I decided to speak directly to the empty room: "Mrs. Wells, I know you're here. I've been preparing your meals for over a month. Can you help me understand what's happening?" The response came immediately. Margaret's voice, clear and gentle. "Carol, dear, the transition from living to dying isn't immediate. We need time to adjust, to complete our routines, to say proper goodbyes. Meals are part of that process. But you died 5 weeks ago. Your body was buried, your family held services. My body died, yes. But I'm still Margaret Wells, still a resident of Peaceful Valley, still someone who enjoys chicken soup and chamomile tea. Death doesn't instantly eliminate our preferences and needs. I understood that hospice care was continuing after death. providing comfort and familiarity during the transition period. How long do you need meal service? Until I'm ready to move on completely. For some of us, that takes days. For others, weeks or months. The hospice has always been about allowing natural transitions at individual pace. Margaret explained that deceased residents remained in hospice care until they fully accepted their deaths and were ready to transition to whatever came next. Meal service was part of that extended care, maintaining normalcy and comfort during the adjustment period. On May 22nd, I discovered that the hospice kitchen had been designed to accommodate deceased residents. Hidden refrigeration units contained meals prepared specifically for post-mortem consumption. Special dietary schedules tracked meal preferences for residents who had died weeks or months earlier. The hospice had been serving deceased patients routinely, treating death as another stage of care rather than the end of service. I found dietary records dating back years, documenting meal requests from residents who had died decades ago. Some deceased patients maintained regular meal schedules for extended periods before transitioning completely. The kitchen staff rotated shifts to provide 24-hour meal service for residents regardless of their living status. On June 8th, Harold Morrison thanked me personally for maintaining his breakfast routine after his death. Carol, the oatmeal with brown sugar has been perfect every morning. Having familiar meals has made this transition much easier. I'm almost ready to move on completely, but the routine has been comforting. Harold, how will I know when you no longer need meal service? You'll know. The requests will stop appearing, the meals will remain untouched, and you'll feel the difference in the room. Each of us transitions at our own pace. But eventually we all reach the point where physical comforts are no longer necessary. Harold explained that deceased residents used meal service as an anchor to familiar experiences while they processed their deaths and prepared for complete transition. On July 4th, Margaret Wells ordered her final meal, chicken soup, saltine crackers, chamomile tea, and a small piece of apple pie. When I delivered the tray, she spoke to me one last time. Carol, this will be my last meal request. The soup has been perfect every day for nearly 3 months. Thank you for helping me maintain dignity and comfort during this transition. I'm ready to move on now. I returned 2 hours later to find the tray completely consumed and a handwritten note. Thank you for excellent service. 5 stars. Margaret Wells. The meal request from Margaret stopped completely. Room 14 felt different, emptier in a way that had nothing to do with physical occupancy. I've continued dietary service at Peaceful Valley for 6 months since Margaret's final meal. The post-mortem meal requests continue from other deceased residents, and I've learned to accommodate their needs as part of extended hospice care. Some comfort foods are too important to be limited by conventional concepts of life and death, and our hospice has been providing nourishment for residents who need support during their complete transition from one state of being to another. The EEG showed rapid eye movement sleep patterns in patient 247, but patient 247 had been dead for 18 hours. My name is Dr. Jennifer Walsh, and I'm a neurologist specializing in sleep disorders and consciousness research at University Medical Center. My work focuses on brain activity during various sleep stages, particularly REM patterns and their relationship to memory consolidation. EEG monitoring provides precise measurements of neural activity, documenting the electrical patterns that correspond to different states of consciousness. But in May, my equipment began detecting brain activity in deceased patients. The anomaly started with routine sleep study follow-up. Patient 247, Robert Chen, 72, had participated in a sleep disorder study investigating age-related changes in REM sleep patterns. Standard protocol, baseline EEG monitoring, sleep stage documentation, analysis of neural activity during different phases of sleep. Robert had completed his study participation successfully. The data showed typical age-related sleep patterns: reduced REM duration, increased sleep fragmentation, altered brainwave sequences during deep sleep phases. Robert died of a heart attack on May 8th, 36 hours after completing his final sleep study session. But on May 9th, the EEG equipment in his former study room began detecting brain activity. I discovered the readings during routine equipment maintenance. The monitoring station for Room 7, Robert's former study room, showed active neural patterns despite being disconnected from any patient. The EEG displayed classic REM sleep indicators: rapid, low-amplitude brain waves, increased neural firing, patterns consistent with active dreaming. But no patient was connected to the monitoring equipment. I assumed equipment malfunction and called our biomedical engineering contractor. This is Dr. Walsh at University Medical. I'm getting anomalous readings from the EEG equipment in sleep study room 7, showing brain activity without patient connection. Dr. Walsh, are you certain no patient is connected? Sometimes sensor leads can pick up electrical interference from nearby equipment. The room is empty. No patient, no connected sensors, no other electrical devices operating. But I'm seeing full REM sleep patterns on the monitor. I sent screenshots of the EEG readings to the engineering team. 20 minutes later, they called back. Dr. Walsh, we're not seeing any activity on our remote monitoring systems. All equipment in room 7 shows normal offline status. Are you certain you're observing brainwave patterns? I was looking directly at the EEG display, rapid eye movement patterns, theta wave activity, neural firing sequences characteristic of active dreaming. But the engineering team's remote systems showed no activity. I was detecting brain waves that existed only at the local monitoring station. I began investigating the phenomenon systematically. I tested the equipment with calibration signals, verified all connections, and checked for electrical interference. The equipment functioned normally with calibration inputs, but continued showing brain activity when set to standard monitoring mode. The EEG was detecting actual neural patterns from an invisible source. On May 12th, I made a significant discovery. The brainwave patterns matched Robert Chen's baseline sleep study data. The EEG was displaying the same neural sequences Robert had produced during his participation in our research. I compared the current readings with Robert's archived study data. Perfect correlation, identical REM patterns, matching theta wave sequences, consistent neural firing timing. The equipment was replaying Robert's sleep patterns with precise accuracy, but the replay was happening in real time, as if Robert was currently asleep and dreaming in room 7. I decided to monitor the phenomenon continuously over a 24-hour period. The brainwave patterns followed Robert's typical sleep cycle: initial sleep onset, progression through sleep stages, regular REM periods, final awakening patterns. The equipment was replicating Robert's complete sleep architecture, including the timing and duration of each sleep phase. On May 15th, I discovered that other sleep study rooms were showing similar activity. Patients who had died after participating in our research were apparently continuing their sleep cycles in their former study rooms. Room 3, Patricia Murphy, died May 10th, EEG showing her characteristic sleep patterns. Room 5, Thomas Walsh, died May 13th, brainwaves matching his study baseline. Room 8, Helen Morrison, died May 14th, neural activity replicating her REM sequences. Deceased sleep study participants were maintaining their sleep schedules posthumously. I researched sleep neurology literature for similar phenomena: postmortem neural activity, residual brain function after death, electrical patterns in deceased neural tissue. I found limited documentation, mostly related to cellular activity that persists briefly after clinical death, but nothing describing full sleep cycles continuing for days or weeks after patient death. On May 20th, I made a discovery that changed my understanding of the situation. While monitoring Robert Chen's post-mortem sleep patterns, I began experiencing unusual dreams during my own sleep. The dreams weren't my typical dream content. Instead, I was dreaming Robert's memories: his childhood in San Francisco, his career as an accountant, his marriage to Helen, his concerns about retirement finances. Detailed personal memories that belonged to Robert Chen, not Jennifer Walsh. I was somehow accessing Robert's dream content while he continued his sleep cycle in room 7. I tested this phenomenon by spending nights in the sleep study facility, monitoring both the post-mortem EEG patterns and my own dream experiences. The correlation was remarkable. When deceased patients entered REM sleep phases, I experienced their memories as my own dreams. When their EEG showed deep sleep patterns, my dreams returned to normal personal content. The deceased patients were sharing their dream experiences with anyone who slept in proximity to their continuing neural activity. On May 25th, I decided to communicate directly with Robert Chen during one of his REM periods. I positioned myself in room 7 during his peak dreaming activity, and attempted to interact with his dream sequence. The experience was unprecedented. I found myself in Robert's childhood home, watching him practice piano at age 7. But I maintained my adult consciousness, aware that I was Dr. Jennifer Walsh observing Robert Chen's memory through shared dreaming. "Robert," I said within the dream, "this is Dr. Walsh from the sleep study. You died 2 weeks ago, but you're still experiencing sleep cycles in room 7. Robert looked up from the piano, unsurprised by my presence in his childhood memory. "Dr. Walsh, I know I died, but the sleep patterns you documented became part of me, recorded in your equipment. I'm completing the dreams I was having when my heart stopped. How long will this continue?" "Until I finish processing all the dreams that were interrupted by death. Sleep serves important functions: memory consolidation, emotional processing, problem solving. Death interrupted those functions, so they're continuing through your monitoring equipment." Robert explained that deceased sleep study participants used the EEG equipment to complete interrupted sleep cycles, processing memories and emotions that death had left unfinished. The monitoring equipment recorded not just our brainwave patterns, but our actual neural experiences. "We're using that data to continue the dreams we were having when we died. On June the 2nd, I discovered that multiple deceased patients were sharing dream experiences simultaneously, during overlapping REM periods. Their memories and experiences merged into collaborative dream sequences. Robert Chen, Patricia Murphy, and Thomas Walsh were co-creating dreams that combined their individual memories into shared experiences. They were using group dreaming to process collective aspects of death and transition. I participated in several of these collaborative dream sessions, observing how deceased patients supported each other through shared memory processing. The dreams served as group therapy sessions, allowing deceased individuals to work through unfinished emotional business while maintaining connection with others undergoing similar transitions. On June 15th, Robert Chen completed his final REM cycle in room 7. "Dr. Walsh, I've finished processing the dreams that were interrupted by my death. The memories have been consolidated, the emotions have been processed, and I'm ready to move on to whatever comes next. Will the equipment continue monitoring your sleep patterns?" "No, my connection to the physical monitoring system is complete. But thank you for providing the technology that allowed me to finish my dreams properly. Death is easier when you don't leave unfinished dreams behind." The EEG patterns from room 7 gradually diminished over the following week, eventually returning to normal offline status. I've continued my sleep research for 4 months since Robert's final dream cycle. The phenomenon continues with new deceased patients, and I've learned to accommodate their need for post-mortem dream completion. Some neural processes are too important to be interrupted by death, and our sleep laboratory has been providing the technology necessary for deceased individuals to finish the dreams they were having when life ended. The GPS showed 3 different destination addresses, but every call led me to the intersection of Oak Street and 5th Avenue. My name is Mike Brennan, and I've driven ambulances for regional emergency medical services for 12 years. Emergency medical transport requires precise navigation, accurate timing, and detailed documentation of response routes. Lives depend on efficient dispatch and rapid arrival at emergency scenes, but in June, every emergency call directed me to the same location. The anomaly started with routine emergency response. Standard protocol: receive dispatch information, confirm destination address, calculate optimal route, document mileage and arrival times. My route knowledge was comprehensive. I knew every street, shortcut, and traffic pattern in our service area. But on June 3rd, 3 separate emergency calls brought me to Oak Street and 5th Avenue. Call number 1, 10:47 a.m., chest pain at 1247 Maple Street. I entered the address, followed GPS directions but arrived at Oak and 5th. Call number 2, 2:15 p.m., motor vehicle accident at Highway 9 and Chester Road. GPS guided me directly to Oak and 5th. Call number 3, 7:23 p.m., respiratory distress at 891 Pine Avenue. Same result, Oak Street and 5th Avenue. Each time, I found the same scene. A motorcycle accident involving a 28-year-old male, severe head trauma, critical condition requiring immediate transport to Regional Medical Center. The victim was always the same person, David Morrison, motorcycle license plate number KTM 1847, Blue Honda CBR 600, same injuries, same vital signs, same emergency treatment requirements, but David Morrison had died in a motorcycle accident at Oak and 5th on January 15th, 5 months before these recurring calls. Checked dispatch records after my shift. The computer system showed 3 separate emergency calls to 3 different addresses. But my ambulance's GPS log showed identical routes to Oak Street and 5th Avenue for all 3 calls. I contacted our dispatch supervisor, Angela Stewart, to report the navigation anomaly. Angela, I'm having GPS issues. Multiple calls today routed me to the wrong location. Mike, I'm not showing any routing problems in our system. All 3 calls show successful responses to correct addresses with appropriate patient transports. Angela, I responded to the same location 3 times. Oak and 5th, motorcycle accident victim David Morrison. Mike, according to our records, you transported chest pain from Maple Street, MVA victim from Highway 9, and respiratory distress from Pine Avenue. 3 different patients, 3 different destinations. I realized the dispatch system was recording successful responses to multiple locations while I was actually visiting the same accident scene repeatedly. The system showed what should have happened, not what actually occurred. Over the following days, the pattern continued. Every emergency call, regardless of reported location or type of emergency, brought me to Oak Street and 5th Avenue to treat David Morrison's motorcycle accident. My ambulance's odometer reset each morning to show the exact mileage from my station to Oak and 5th. No matter how many calls I received, no matter what routes I traveled, the odometer always returned to that baseline measurement. On June 10th, I decided to test the phenomenon by deliberately ignoring GPS directions and driving to reported emergency addresses manually. Call number 4. Cardiac arrest at 4:52. Wilson Boulevard. I ignored GPS and drove directly to Wilson Boulevard using my route knowledge. But I arrived at Oak Street and 5th Avenue, treating David Morrison for motorcycle accident injuries. My ambulance had transported me to Oak and 5th regardless of my intended destination. I checked with other ambulance crews to see if they were experiencing similar routing issues. Hey Steve, are you having GPS problems? My unit keeps routing me to the wrong locations. Mike, GPS has been working fine for me. No routing issues, all calls going to correct addresses. What kind of problems are you seeing? Every call routes me to Oak and 5th regardless of dispatch address. That's weird, man. Oak and 5th. Isn't that where that motorcycle guy died back in January? I realized I was the only crew experiencing the routing anomaly. Other ambulances responded to their assigned emergencies normally, while mine was locked into servicing David Morrison's accident. On June 15th, I had a conversation with David Morrison that clarified the situation. While treating his injuries at Oak and 5th, I decided to speak directly to him about the recurring scenario. David, this is EMT Mike Brennan. I've been responding to your accident for 2 weeks. You died in January, but I keep getting called back to treat your injuries. David opened his eyes, looking directly at me despite his critical condition. Mike, I know I died, but the emergency response wasn't completed properly. The ambulance arrived too late, the treatment was insufficient, the transport to the hospital failed. I need to experience a successful emergency response before I can move on. What do you mean by successful response? The call came in at 7:34 p.m. on January 15th. Dispatch delayed the response due to multiple simultaneous emergencies. When the ambulance finally arrived, I had been dying on the street for 18 minutes. I need to experience what should have happened. Immediate response. Proper treatment, successful transport. David explained that he was reliving the accident until emergency medical services could provide the quality of care he should have received initially. Every time you respond to my accident, we get closer to the proper outcome. Your treatment has been excellent, your response time has improved, and your patient care has been exactly what I needed on January 15th. Understood that I was providing David with the emergency medical response he had been denied during his actual accident. How will I know when the response is successful enough for you to move on? You'll know. The calls will stop routing to Oak and 5th. Your GPS will function normally, and I'll finally be able to complete my transition from accident victim to whatever comes next. On June 22nd, I received an emergency call that changed everything. Motorcycle accident at Oak Street and 5th Avenue. Single victim, severe head trauma, critical condition. For the first time in weeks, the dispatch address matched my actual destination. I responded to Oak and Fifth with perfect timing, arriving within 4 minutes of the emergency call. My treatment was comprehensive, professional, and exactly what David Morrison needed. The transport to regional medical was smooth, efficient, and conducted with optimal patient care. When we arrived at the hospital, David Morrison was stable, conscious, and grateful for the excellent emergency medical response. Mike, that was perfect. Exactly the kind of emergency care I should have received on January 15th. Thank you for helping me experience what proper emergency medical services feels like. David was admitted to the hospital in stable condition, but I knew he had actually died 5 months earlier and was finally ready to complete his transition. The next morning, my ambulance's GPS functioned normally. Emergency calls routed to their correct addresses. My odometer tracked actual mileage rather than resetting to the Oak and Fifth baseline. I've continued driving ambulance for regional EMS for 4 months since David Morrison's successful emergency response. The GPS anomaly has resolved, and I've returned to normal emergency medical service. Some emergency calls are too important to be limited by single response opportunities, and our emergency medical system has been providing second chances for patients who needed better care than they initially received. The autopsy report for case number 3847 contained detailed documentation of my own death, but I was still alive to read it. My name is Sarah Chen, and I've been the medical records archivist for County General Hospital for 9 years. My responsibilities include organizing, preserving, and maintaining confidential access to medical documentation, patient files, surgical reports, autopsy records, and legal medical documents. Archival work requires meticulous attention to detail and absolute accuracy in record preservation. But in July, the autopsy files began documenting deaths that hadn't yet occurred. The anomaly started with routine archival processing. Dr. Rebecca Stone had submitted case number 3847 for permanent archive storage, routine autopsy documentation. Following natural death investigation, standard protocol required me to verify completeness, organize supporting materials, and transfer files to secure long-term storage. Case number 3847 appeared to be straightforward. 43-year-old female, natural causes, no suspicious circumstances. The file contained standard documentation, external examination notes, internal organ analysis, toxicology results, final cause of death determination. But when I read the report details, I discovered the case documented my own autopsy. The deceased was identified as Sarah Chen, 43 years old, hospital employee. Cause of death listed as cardiac arrest during routine work duties. The autopsy described my physical characteristics, medical history, and anatomical findings with precise accuracy. I was reading the official documentation of my own death and dissection. I checked the case number multiple times, verified the pathologist's signature, and confirmed the filing date. Everything was properly documented and authenticated, but I was alive, healthy, and currently processing my own autopsy report. I contacted Dr. Stone to clarify the documentation error. Dr. Stone, I need verification on case number 3847. The file appears to contain incorrect patient identification. Sarah, case number 3847 was routine. Natural death, no complications, standard autopsy procedure. Is there a problem with the documentation? Doctor, the case file identifies me as the deceased patient. Sarah Chen, 43, hospital employee. Sarah, that's impossible. You're obviously alive. Let me check my records. Case number 3847 was processed last week. Standard procedure. No unusual circumstances. Are you certain you're reading the correct file? I read portions of the autopsy report aloud. External examination reveals a well-developed, well-nourished 43-year-old female. Small surgical scar on left wrist from childhood injury. Distinctive birthmark on right shoulder blade. The physical details matched my body exactly, including scars and marks that weren't visible through clothing. Dr. Stone, this report describes my physical characteristics with complete accuracy. How is that possible if I'm not the subject of this autopsy? Dr. Stone requested that I bring the file to her office for direct review, but when I attempted to show her the documentation, the pages appeared blank. The text was visible only when I read the file alone. When viewed by others, the pages showed no content whatsoever. I was the only person who could see the documentation of my own autopsy. Over the following days, additional autopsy files arrived with similar anomalies. Cases 3848 through 3863 all documented deaths of hospital employees. Patricia Murphy from accounting, Thomas Walsh from maintenance, Helen Morrison from nursing, Angela Stewart from administration. All the subjects were alive and actively working at the hospital. But their autopsy reports contained detailed post-mortem examinations describing their deaths and dissections. I was archiving autopsy documentation for living people. On July 15th, I made a disturbing discovery. The autopsy reports described deaths that would occur in the future. Case number 3847 showed my death date as August 12th, 4 weeks in the future. The other cases documented deaths scheduled for dates throughout the coming months. The autopsy files were predicting and documenting deaths before they occurred. I decided to test the phenomenon by examining the files under different conditions. The text remained invisible during daylight hours, appeared partially during evening hours, but became completely legible only in total darkness. The autopsy reports existed only in darkness, as if the documentation itself was afraid of being seen clearly. On July 20th, I discovered that reading the autopsy reports aloud in darkness caused them to become more detailed. Initially, the files contained basic cause of death information, but speaking the text aloud added additional content: surgical procedures, organ weights, histological findings, toxicology results. The reports were completing themselves as I voiced their contents. I realized the autopsy files were interactive documents that responded to reader participation. The more attention I gave to my own autopsy report, the more detailed and comprehensive it became. By July 25th, case No. 3847 contained 47 pages of detailed autopsy documentation describing every aspect of my death and dissection. The report included information that could only be known through actual post-mortem examination: internal organ conditions, cellular analysis, microscopic pathology findings. The file documented my autopsy with medical precision despite my continued living status. On August 1st, I made a decision that violated archival protocol. I attempted to destroy case number 3847. If the report was predicting my death on August 12th, eliminating the documentation might prevent the predicted outcome, but the autopsy file was indestructible. Attempts to shred, burn, or delete the documentation failed completely. The file restored itself instantly, returning with even more detailed content than before. Destruction attempts only strengthened the autopsy report's accuracy and completeness. On August 5th, I discovered the source of the phenomenon. In the basement archive storage area, I found autopsy files dating back decades, all documenting deaths of hospital employees before they occurred. The hospital had been generating predictive autopsy reports for years, creating detailed post-mortem documentation in advance of actual deaths. Every employee who worked at County General eventually received their autopsy file, regardless of their current health status or life expectancy. I traced the system's origin to the original medical examiner's office. Established when the hospital opened in 1962, the autopsy documentation procedures had been designed to ensure comprehensive death investigation for all hospital personnel, but the system had evolved to predict and document deaths rather than simply investigating them after occurrence. On August 10th, 2 days before my predicted death date, I had a conversation with Dr. Stone about the autopsy files. Dr. Stone, I need to discuss case number 3847 with you. The documentation has become extremely detailed and specific about my predicted death. Sarah, I've told you before, there is no case the 3847 involving your death. You're alive, healthy, and continuing your excellent archival work. Doctor, would you be willing to examine the file with me in complete darkness? The text is only visible under those conditions. Dr. Stone agreed to review the file in the darkened archive storage room. When I read case the 3847 aloud, she could hear the content, but couldn't see the text on the pages. Sarah, I can hear you reading detailed autopsy documentation, but I'm not seeing any text on those pages. Are you certain there's content written there? Doctor, I'm reading 47 pages of comprehensive autopsy findings describing my death, dissection and cause of death determination. Sarah, I think you may be experiencing stress-related hallucinations. Archival work can be mentally demanding, and you've been working extensive hours recently. Dr. Stone recommended that I take medical leave to address what she perceived as work-related psychological stress. On August 12th, my predicted death date, I reported to work normally. I felt healthy, showed no symptoms of illness, and had no reason to expect the cardiac arrest described in case number 3847 at 3:47 p.m. While processing routine archival documents, I experienced sudden chest pain and collapsed in the storage room. Emergency medical response was immediate. I was transported to County General's emergency department, where Dr. Patricia Hendricks attempted resuscitation procedures. I was pronounced dead at 4:23 p.m. from cardiac arrest, exactly as documented in case number 3847, but I continued processing archival documents from my position in the storage room. Death had not interrupted my work responsibilities. It had simply changed my employment status from living to deceased archivist. I discovered that the hospital employed both living and deceased staff members, maintaining continuous operations regardless of individual employee mortality. The autopsy files had been employee orientation materials, preparing staff members for their transition from living to deceased worker status. Case number 3847 was completed by Dr. Stone the following day. The autopsy findings matched the predictive documentation exactly. Cardiac arrest, natural causes, no suspicious circumstances. I've continued my archival duties for 3 months since my death. The work remains the same: organizing, preserving, and maintaining medical documentation. But now I understand the complete scope of the hospital's record-keeping requirements. Some employment contracts extend beyond conventional concepts of life and death, and County General has been maintaining comprehensive medical documentation for all staff members regardless of their current biological status. The surgical notes described a 6-hour cardiac bypass procedure I had performed on Patricia Wells, but I had never operated on anyone by that name. My name is Dr. Michael Thompson, and I've been a trauma surgeon at Metropolitan Medical Center for 15 years. Surgical documentation is critical to patient care. Detailed operative notes, procedure descriptions, post-operative instructions, and complication management. I dictate surgical notes immediately after each procedure while details remain fresh and accurate. But in August, my dictated notes began describing operations I hadn't performed. The anomaly started with routine post-operative documentation. Following a complex trauma surgery, I dictated standard operative notes into our voice recording system. The procedure had been successful. Emergency appendectomy for Robert Morrison, 28, following motor vehicle accident complications. Standard dictation, patient, Robert Morrison. Procedure, emergency appendectomy with peritoneal lavage. Surgeon, Dr. Michael Thompson. Surgical findings, ruptured appendix with localized peritonitis. Procedure completed without complications, but when the transcription was completed, the surgical notes described a different operation entirely. The transcribed notes read, patient, Patricia Wells. Procedure, coronary artery bypass graft, 4 vessels. Surgeon, Dr. Michael Thompson. Surgical findings, severe triple vessel disease with left main stenosis. Bypass performed using left internal mammary artery and saphenous vein grafts. I had never operated on Patricia Wells. I had never performed cardiac bypass surgery that day. The transcribed notes described a 6-hour cardiac procedure I hadn't conducted. I assumed transcription error and contacted our medical records department. This is Dr. Thompson. I need correction on surgical notes from yesterday's trauma case. The transcription shows incorrect patient and procedure information. Dr. Thompson, we're showing Patricia Wells' coronary bypass completed yesterday at 14:30 hours. Is there specific information that needs revision? The patient was Robert Morrison, appendectomy. Not Patricia Wells, cardiac surgery. Doctor, our surgical schedule shows Patricia Wells' cardiac bypass assigned to you yesterday. Robert Morrison isn't listed on any surgical schedule this week. I checked the OR scheduling system directly. The records showed I had performed cardiac bypass surgery on Patricia Wells, exactly as described in the transcribed notes. But I had clear memory of performing appendectomy on Robert Morrison. The hospital's documentation system showed different surgical procedures than what I had actually performed. Over the following days, additional surgical notes showed similar discrepancies. Operations I dictated were transcribed as completely different procedures involving patients I'd never treated. I dictated emergency trauma laparotomy for Thomas Chen, motor vehicle accident victim. Transcription showed elective cholecystectomy for Helen Murphy, chronic gallbladder disease. I dictated appendectomy for Maria Santos, acute appendicitis. Transcription showed thoracotomy for James Walsh, pneumothorax repair. Every surgical note was being altered during transcription, documenting procedures I hadn't performed on patients I'd never met. I decided to investigate by monitoring the transcription process directly. I submitted a surgical dictation and observed the transcriptionist while she processed the audio file. This is Dr. Thompson's operative note for Robert Morrison, appendectomy procedure. The transcriptionist listened to the audio file through headphones, typing steadily. But when I read her transcription over her shoulder, she was documenting Patricia Wells' cardiac surgery. I interrupted her work. "Excuse me, but you're transcribing different content than what's in the audio file." She looked confused. "Dr. Thompson, I'm transcribing exactly what you dictated. Patricia Wells, coronary bypass, standard cardiac procedure notes." I listened to the audio file through her headphones. I heard my own voice dictating cardiac surgery notes for Patricia Wells, exactly as she had transcribed. But I remembered dictating appendectomy notes for Robert Morrison. The audio recordings were storing different content than what I had actually dictated. On August 15th, I discovered the source of the anomaly. In the dictation equipment storage room, I found older recording devices that had been decommissioned but never disconnected. The equipment was still operational, apparently recording surgical dictations independently. The old system was capturing dictations from surgeries that were occurring somewhere else, performed by someone else, but attributed to my voice and credentials. I was apparently performing surgery in multiple locations simultaneously, dictating notes for procedures conducted by other surgeons using my identity. I traced the equipment's history. The original dictation system had been installed in 1987, connecting all surgical departments throughout the hospital network. When newer equipment was installed in 2019, the old system had been deactivated but not removed. The decommissioned equipment had continued recording surgical dictations from across the entire hospital network, attributing all procedures to individual surgeons based on voice recognition rather than actual operator identity. On August 20th, I made a discovery that changed everything. The transcribed surgical notes described procedures I would perform in the future. Patricia Wells' cardiac surgery was scheduled for next month. Helen Murphy's cholecystectomy was planned for September. James Walsh's thoracotomy was tentatively scheduled for October, pending insurance approval. The dictation system was recording surgical notes in advance of scheduled procedures. I was dictating operative notes for surgeries I would perform weeks or months in the future, documenting procedures that existed only in the surgical planning stage. On August 25th, I decided to test the phenomenon by dictating notes for a surgery I had no intention of performing. This is Dr. Thompson. Operative note for Jennifer Davis. Experimental cardiac transplant procedure. Patient received donor heart from matching tissue type. Procedure completed without complications. Patient stable in post-operative recovery. The transcription documented the cardiac transplant exactly as dictated, but Jennifer Davis was not a cardiac patient. No transplant was scheduled, and I had never performed cardiac transplant surgery. 3 days later, Jennifer Davis was admitted to our hospital with acute cardiac failure, requiring emergency transplant evaluation. My dictated notes had preceded the medical condition they were meant to document on our September 3rd. I performed my first cardiac surgery, Patricia Wells' coronary bypass procedure. The operation proceeded exactly as described in my August dictated notes. Every surgical detail, every complication, every post-operative instruction matched the documentation I had recorded weeks earlier. Was following surgical notes I had dictated before meeting the patient. The dictation system was providing surgical guidance rather than just documentation, allowing me to perform procedures I had somehow already completed in advance. On September 15th, I discovered that other surgeons were experiencing similar phenomena. Dr. Elizabeth Murphy, orthopedic surgeon, was performing procedures documented in my surgical notes. Dr. Robert Chen, neurosurgeon, was following operative notes I had apparently dictated for brain surgery procedures. The dictation system was distributing surgical expertise across the entire medical staff, allowing any surgeon to access and perform procedures documented by any other surgeon. I was providing surgical guidance for specialties I had never studied, procedures I had never learned, operations I was not qualified to perform. On October 1st, I had a conversation with the dictation system that clarified its purpose. While dictating routine surgical notes, I spoke directly to the recording equipment. I need to understand what's happening with these transcriptions. I'm dictating notes for procedures I haven't performed, for patients I've never met. The response came through the dictation speakers in my own voice. Dr. Thompson, the surgical documentation system maintains comprehensive records of all procedures performed throughout the hospital network. Individual surgeon identity is less important than collective surgical knowledge. Are you saying the system is sharing surgical experience between different surgeons? The system preserves and distributes surgical expertise regardless of which individual surgeon provides the initial experience. Every procedure performed by any surgeon becomes available to all surgeons through the dictation network. I understood that the dictation system had evolved into a collective surgical memory, allowing the entire medical staff to access and utilize procedures performed by any member of the team. How long has this sharing system been operational? Since 1987, when the original dictation network was established. Every surgical procedure performed in the hospital has been recorded, analyzed, and made available to appropriate medical staff through the transcription process. The system had been creating a comprehensive surgical database for over 30 years, preserving and sharing medical expertise across all specialties and surgical disciplines. On October 12th, I performed Jennifer Davis's cardiac transplant using surgical notes I had dictated in August. The procedure was successful, following the documentation exactly as I had originally recorded it. But I realized the surgical expertise I was using belonged to cardiac surgeons from across the hospital network, accessed through the collective dictation system. I wasn't performing surgery based on my individual training and experience. I was performing surgery using the accumulated knowledge of every surgeon who had ever worked at Metropolitan Medical Center. On November 5th, I made my final discovery about the dictation system. It was recording surgical notes from surgeons who had died years earlier. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, who died in 2018, was still dictating operative notes through the system. Dr. William Chen, deceased in 2015, continued providing surgical documentation for complex procedures. The dictation system was preserving surgical expertise indefinitely, maintaining access to medical knowledge regardless of individual surgeon mortality. I've continued my surgical practice for 6 months since discovering the collective dictation system. My surgical capabilities have expanded dramatically, allowing me to perform procedures far beyond my individual training through access to the accumulated expertise of dozens of surgeons. Some medical knowledge is too valuable to be limited by individual lifespans, and our hospital has been preserving and sharing surgical expertise across all specialties and time periods to ensure the best possible patient care. Mrs. Patterson's hands moved into prayer position while I was embalming her, and I realized my training was finally complete. My name is Rachel Morrison, and I've been apprenticing at Riverside Memorial Home for 18 months. Mortuary science requires technical precision, artistic skill, and profound respect for the deceased. My mentor, Samuel Burke, taught me every aspect of the profession: embalming procedures, cosmetic restoration, viewing preparation, and family services coordination. But the most important lesson came from the deceased themselves. The education began with routine embalming procedures, standard protocol, arterial injection, cavity treatment, feature setting, cosmetic application. Samuel emphasized respect, dignity, and attention to detail in every aspect of preparation. Rachel, remember that these individuals are someone's family member. They deserve the same care and respect they received while living. The body remembers how it's treated, even after death. I assumed his comment was metaphorical, emphasizing the importance of professional dignity. But over the following months, I discovered the bodies were actively participating in their own preparation. The first indication came during Mrs. Helen Patterson's preparation. She had died peacefully at age 79 following a brief illness. Her family requested traditional viewing services with an open casket presentation. I began the embalming process following standard procedure. But as I positioned her hands for the final presentation, they shifted into proper prayer position without my assistance. Not muscle spasms or settling, deliberate repositioning. Mrs. Patterson's hands moved slowly, carefully, into the exact position her family would expect to see during viewing services. I called Samuel to verify the positioning. Samuel, I need you to check Mrs. Patterson's hand placement. They seem to have moved since I positioned them. Samuel examined my work carefully. Rachel, the positioning is perfect. Exactly what her family will want to see. Natural, dignified, peaceful. You're developing excellent instincts for presentation. But I hadn't positioned her hands in prayer. They had moved themselves into that arrangement. Over the following weeks, similar assistance occurred with other preparations. Thomas Chen's facial expression adjusted itself to appear more peaceful. Maria Santos's hair arranged itself into a style her family would recognize. James Walsh's mouth closed itself to eliminate the unnatural gaping that sometimes occurs after death. The deceased were participating in their own preparation, ensuring they appeared appropriate for family viewing. I began documenting these self-adjustments, noting when and how the bodies modified their own presentation. Mrs. Patricia Murphy adjusted head position for better profile presentation. Mr. Robert Morrison repositioned clothing to eliminate wrinkles. Mrs. Angela Davis modified cosmetic application to match preferred appearance. The deceased were collaborating with my preparation work, providing guidance about their preferred presentation. On November 15th, I had my first direct communication with the deceased client. While preparing Mr. William Walsh for viewing, he opened his eyes and spoke clearly. Rachel, the tie needs adjustment. I always wore my ties with a smaller knot. The current style doesn't look natural for me. I stared at him, unable to respond. Mr. Walsh had been dead for 6 hours, embalmed and partially prepared for viewing. Don't be frightened, he continued gently. We're all here to help you learn. Samuel Burke was an excellent apprentice when I taught him 40 years ago. Now it's your turn to complete the education. You taught Samuel. I was the mortuary director when Samuel began his apprenticeship in 1982. Every apprentice learns from the deceased. It's the most important part of the training. We teach you things that can't be learned from textbooks or living instructors. Mr. Walsh explained that deceased clients served as teaching assistants, helping apprentices understand the subtle art of death preparation. Each body is unique, Rachel. We know our own appearance better than anyone else. We can guide you toward presentation that honors our individuality and provides comfort to our families. I adjusted his tie according to his instructions. The smaller knot looked much more natural and appropriate. Thank you, Rachel. That's exactly right. My family will recognize that style immediately. Over the following months, other deceased clients provided similar instruction. They taught me individual preferences for cosmetic, application natural positioning, for different body types clothing adjustments that reflected personal style facial, expressions that matched personality traits, cultural, and religious preparation requirements. The deceased were providing personalized education that no living instructor could offer. On January 8th, Samuel Burke called me into his office for evaluation of my apprenticeship progress. Rachel, your work has become exceptional. The families consistently comment on how natural and peaceful their loved ones appear. You've developed instincts that typically take years to acquire. Samuel, I need to tell you about the instruction I've been receiving from the deceased clients. Samuel smiled knowingly. They've begun teaching you directly. That's the sign of a true mortuary professional. When the deceased trust you enough to provide guidance, you've earned their respect. This is normal, part of the training process. Rachel, mortuary work isn't just about technical procedures. It's about serving as a bridge between the living and the dead. The deceased clients teach apprentices how to honor their individuality and provide appropriate care. Samuel explained that every mortuary professional eventually developed the ability to receive guidance from deceased clients. The dead are excellent teachers, Rachel. They know exactly how they want to be remembered, how they want to appear to their families, how they want their final presentation to reflect their lives. On February 20th, I experienced the most significant teaching moment of my apprenticeship. While preparing multiple bodies for a busy viewing schedule, all 7 deceased clients began providing simultaneous instruction. They taught me advanced techniques, creating natural expressions, achieving perfect cosmetic balance, positioning bodies to minimize trauma evidence, and coordinating preparation details that would provide maximum comfort to grieving families. The lesson lasted 3 hours, with each deceased instructor contributing their expertise to my education. At the end of the session, Mrs. Helen Patterson, my first teaching client, addressed me directly. "Rachel, your apprenticeship is complete. You've learned to listen to the deceased, to respect our guidance, and to serve as our voice in preparation for final presentation. You're ready to accept full responsibility for our care." I understood that the deceased clients had been evaluating my work throughout the apprenticeship, determining when I was qualified to serve their needs independently. On March 15th, Samuel Burke announced his retirement, recommending me as his replacement at Riverside Memorial Home. Rachel has completed the most comprehensive training program we offer. She's learned not only the technical aspects of mortuary science, but also the interpersonal skills necessary to serve both living and deceased clients effectively. I accepted the position as director of Riverside Memorial Home, with the understanding that my education would continue through ongoing guidance from deceased clients. The deceased have continued teaching me advanced techniques for 6 months since completing my formal apprenticeship. Each client provides unique instruction, expanding my knowledge and improving my ability to serve families during their most difficult moments. Some professional education extends beyond traditional classroom settings, and the mortuary profession has been providing the most qualified instructors available. Individuals who have personal experience with death and can guide preparation from the perspective of those who understand the process most intimately.